George Tsilis, our senior markets correspondent, checking out some new data released on the company's neurodegenerative efforts. A pretty big medical area right now, George. Things, ALS, you got obviously Alzheimer's, all kinds of stuff that a lot of folks are going after, and many others kind of in that periphery.
Yeah, there's a lot of work right now, breakthrough work to deal with neurodegenerative diseases, OJ, and Biohaven is one of these biotech companies that is making efforts to bring some treatments, if not cures, for certain diseases. Now, one of the things about this particular business and the reason the stock is actually higher today is they actually demonstrated some very promising endpoint meets for their neurodegenerative disease that focuses primarily on spinal muscular atrophy, which is essentially a very rare but devastating breakdown of physical mobility and speech for patients. So they actually beat the primary endpoints, coming in for about 50 to 70% improvement for the disease progression over 3 years. So this wasn't essentially a small, very constrained time trial. This is a drug that is in phase 3. And they had 3 years to actually prove these endpoint targets, which they actually beat. So that in and of itself is very promising. But for the company itself, there's also a couple other drugs that are in phase 3 that help treat things like major depressive disorder and obsessive compulsive disorder, but also epilepsy. So this is not essentially a one-hit wonder kind of company. They do have multiple drugs, 3 primary ones that are in phase 3 trials that essentially right now they're getting some promising endpoints, at least for their spinal muscular atrophy drug. So with that said, if you look at the price action, it's actually very promising today. A couple of analysts actually upgraded the stock in terms of their price targets with outperform ratings. Piper increased their target to $76. And if you look at Baird, they also increased their target to $60. Now, we talk about biopharma quite often, and some of the things we need to note or talk about is what's going on with the history of the company, what's going on with the products, but also what's going on with financials. And one of the things you'll notice about the company is it hasn't been publicly traded for very long. And in fact, it's only been a couple of years, September 2022. So this company was actually spun off from Pfizer. And effectively, since then, it's been a free-floating, publicly traded company, started trading around $7 per share. So just looking at that relative to the closing price, the stock is up over 500% over the last 2 years. But ironically enough, the company hasn't generated any revenue whatsoever. Now, we talk about companies that don't generate revenue, especially biotech companies. It doesn't necessarily mean it's an end-all for the company. Obviously, they're spending quite a bit of money for R&D and to develop their drugs, but partnerships make a huge difference. And if you look at some of the partnerships that Biohaven has, they actually have a partnership and a collaborative agreement with Yale University, AstraZeneca, and they also have a supply agreement with Regeneron. So the company itself seems to have some big backers for their endpoint products, and I think this is one of the reasons why, irrespective of the fact that they haven't generated any revenues, they're getting some analysts that are backing the name.
Yeah, it seems like their study expanded significantly in terms of the number of patients they were able to record. I'm not even going to try and say the name of their treatment, but it's for a condition called spinocerebellar ataxia, loss of muscle control, balance. So extremely degenerative disease that does kind of sound like others, but is very rare. So they would be the first treatment of this. And the first FDA attempt didn't really go so well. So it seems like maybe this was a much better statistical kind of like legitimacy to their case for moving this forward.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, they actually beat the primary endpoint expectations, and going into the announcement today, there was expectations that they would achieve them, these milestone primary endpoints. They did beat those primary endpoints.
That's good.
And with that said, it looks like the company itself may reach a milestone payment coming up at the end of this year for $10 million. So it looks like they're going to be starting to generate revenue, at least from collaborative licensing agreements.
Right.
But at the same time, this increases the probability that the FDA will approve it coming up next year in 2025.
Always important for these companies to hit those milestones, extend the lifespan, tap into liquidity, big deal. I can see why the stock rallies on it for sure. But it's still a pretty long ways to go. But meeting the endpoint, which is what they failed to do in the last application a year ago to the FDA, seems like a big piece of progress. quick thought on the technicals, George, on the chart?
Well, yeah, I mean, looking at the chart, like I said, they haven't generated any revenue. They're expecting to generate, like I said, 10 million by the end of this year.
Good breakout.
But I think meaningfully speaking, from a technical standpoint, it did break above the 200-day moving average. So it may retrace back to the $43 or so level. But keep in mind that they're probably going to come to market with a secondary offering, considering zero revenues and about $750 million in operating expenses per annum.
Okay. All right. Nice breakout. Nice chart. Nice analysis. Thanks, GT.